Welcome back to Mr. DuPage's classroom. This lesson is for my Algebra 1 class. It is 10.5 Day 1, solving quadratic equations by completing the square. Completing the square is a method that will always work. It is a type of factoring and combines solution strategies from both factoring and using square roots. To use this method successfully, we need to remember some concepts about factoring and perfect squares. So the first question we want to ask is, what is a perfect square? Well, a perfect square is any number whose square root is a whole number. So an example of that would be the square root of 100. 100 is a perfect square because the square root of it is plus or minus 10. So 100 is a perfect square. What we want to do now is list 15 different perfect squares. We're going to start with the lowest perfect square, which is 0, and we're going to go all the way up to the perfect square that is 14 squared. So it'd be 0, 1, 4, 9, 25, 36, 49, 64, 81, 100, 121, 144, 169, 196, and just because I like the 15 squared, it's 225. Okay? So those are all of your perfect squares from 0 squared all the way up to 15 squared. Now, let's continue through. The next thing we want to do is go ahead and look at what it would look like if we multiplied x plus 6 squared. So we're going to take x plus 6 times x plus 6. Remember, when we multiply this, we need to use FOIL. So first, outer, x squared plus 6x, inner, plus 6x, last, plus 36. I can go ahead and combine like terms. So x squared plus 12x plus 36. What that is known as is a perfect square trinomial. It's a perfect square trinomial because of these 6x and the 6x and the fact that 36 is a perfect square. That is what we're going to be trying to put together as we're completing the square. We're going to take a problem like 2, an example like 2, where I have x squared plus 10x, and I want to fill in that blank with a perfect square. Well, the perfect square is going to come from the b value, or 10 in this case. It's going to come from this number. How I'm going to fill in the blank is I'm going to take that b value, 10, I'm going to take b, divide by 2, and square it. So my b value in this case is 10 divided by 2 squared. Well, 10 divided by 2 is 5. I'm going to take 5 squared, which is 25. That is what I'm going to put in the blank. So I have completed the square. I take my middle term, my middle number. In this case, it was 10. I'm going to divide it by 2, and I'm going to square it. Okay? That's how I complete the square. So in example 3, we have 3 more problems where we need to complete the square. So in the first one, I'm going to take negative 12, divide by 2, and square it, which is negative 6 squared, which is positive 36. What you're going to notice is every time you complete the square, that number is always going to be positive. Okay? Why don't you go ahead and try the next 2 examples on your own. I will have the answers for you, so go ahead and pause the video. As soon as you're done attempting them, go ahead and turn it back on, and the answers will be there for you. If you have any questions on them, make sure you bring them to me tomorrow. And there are your answers to the next 2 examples. Make sure you check your work against mine to see if you got it right. If you have any issues with that, make sure you bring them to me tomorrow. Okay? Now, on to example 4 and 5. We're going to solve these 2 examples using completing the square. So our first step is exactly what we've been doing before, where I want to fill in the blank with my middle term first. So I'm going to take 10, divide by 2, and square it. So 10 divided by 2 is 5. squared, which is 25. So I'm going to fill in both blanks with 25 because anything I add to one side, I must also add to the other side. Okay? Notice how we got our blanks. We just went from this equation up here, down here. We just add the two blanks. We know we want to put a perfect square trinomial together, so we go ahead and put the blanks in. As long as whatever I put in on the left side, I also put it on the right side, it is fine. Okay? Now, at this point, what I want to do to solve this is I actually want to factor this perfect square trinomial. Well, there is an easier way to factor it than actually using a factor tree like we have in the past. If you want to use a factor tree, that's perfectly fine. If you're comfortable with a factor tree and you'd rather use that, that is perfectly fine. But there is a much easier way to do it. I can just use this number right here, and I can plug it into a setup like this. Every single time from now until the end of this class, at least, every time you complete the square, you are going to use this setup. The only thing you have to figure out is what to put in the parenthesis with the x, and that's where that number comes into play. If it's a positive number, I'm going to add. If it's a negative number, I'm going to subtract. Okay? Now, what goes on the other side of the equal sign is this up here. So 24 plus 25 goes right down here, which is 49. Okay? At this point, we can use our knowledge of square roots to solve the rest of this problem. So since I have x plus 5 squared equals 49, I can go ahead and square root both sides. It gets me x plus 5 equals plus or minus 7. Do not forget about the plus or minus. It is extremely important in these problems. Okay? Now, because I do have plus or minus, I do have two separate equations. I can go ahead and split those up now. X plus 5 equals 7, and x plus 5 equals negative 7. Can subtract the 5 from both sides, so x equals 2. Subtract the 5 from both sides, x equals negative 12. And that is how we use completing the square to solve an example. Okay. Why don't you go ahead and try 5 on your own. See if you can, or if you have this figured out. I will come back after you pause the video. I will come back with a completed problem so you can check your work against mine. And again, you can always come with questions tomorrow. So go ahead and pause the video and see how you can do. That is the completed problem. Check my work against yours and see how you did. If you have any questions or concerns, if you can't figure out any mistakes that you made, make sure you come and see me and we can talk about it. Let's move on to the back. Solve the following equations by completing the square, round to the nearest hundredth if necessary. When we are completing the square, I will allow you to use decimals. In the past, we've only been able to use fractions. In this case, we can use decimals. So what we're going to do in problem 6, the very first step to completing the square is to create our blank that comes after this 7x. So in order to do that, what I have to do first is add this 5. So then I have x squared plus 7x plus blank equals 5 plus blank. Okay. At this point, I can go ahead and complete the square. So I'm going to take my middle term 7, divide by 2, and square it. Well, 7 divided by 2 is 3.5. I'm going to square that. 3.5 squared is 12.25. Remember, 12.25 goes in the blank on the left and in the blank on the right. Okay. At this point, I need to factor, so I need to use my 3.5 here. It'll be x plus 3.5 squared equals the 5 plus 12.25 is what comes down here. So that is 17.25. I can go ahead and square root at this point. So x plus 3.5 equals plus or minus 4.15. Okay. And again, at this point, I have two equations, so I can go ahead and split them up. So it'll be x plus 3.5 equals 4.15, and x plus 3.5 equals negative 4.15. Subtract 3.5 from both sides. And x equals, that'd be 0.65. Subtract 3.5 from both sides. X equals negative 7.65. Let's go back up to example 7. Now example 7 has already moved the number for me, so I do not have to move that negative 75. All I have to do is create my blank behind the negative 20x and behind the negative 75. So I'm going to go ahead and create my blank. Remember, anything that I create on one side, I must also create on the other side. I can go ahead and complete my square now. So negative 20 divided by 2 squared equals negative 10 squared, which is 100. Okay. At this point, I'm going to go ahead and factor, which means I'm going to use the negative 10 here. So I have x minus 10 squared equals negative 75 plus 100 is 25. At this point, I can go ahead and take the square root of both sides. So x minus 10 equals plus or minus 5. X minus 10 equals positive 5, and x minus 10 equals negative 5. Add 10 to both sides. X equals 15. Add 10 to both sides. X equals 5. Again, what I would like you to do for examples 8 and 9 is go ahead and try those on your own. Don't forget to move the 21 and the 5 before you get started. You have to create those blanks. So why don't you go ahead and try 8 and 9 on your own. Let's see how you can do. When you are done, make sure you unpause the video, check your work against mine, and we'll go from there. Go ahead and pause the video now. Alright, and here are your answers to examples 8 and 9. For example 8, your answers would be negative 2 and negative 8. And for example 9, your answer will be no real solution. Now, we haven't quite talked about that yet, but you should remember from our square root section that if I try to take the square root of a negative, my answer will be no real solution. And that's the same scenario we have here. Try to take the square root of a negative, my answer is no real solution. Okay? Let's go ahead and move on to the end here. Thus, we have 3 methods for solving quadratics. What are our normal 3 methods? You already knew the 3 methods before today. This is just another form of factoring. So factoring is one of those 3 methods. Graphing is another form of this, or another method that we would use. And the final method we would use is square roots. Those are your 3 methods of solving quadratics. Make sure you go through this video, and any part of the note sheet that did not make sense to you, make sure you come in and see me. If you have any questions, I will see you tomorrow. Otherwise, thank you very much for watching the video, and have a great day.